Thank you, and welcome back. We're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and my guests are Dr. LaFayette and Dr. Moore, Dr. Wayne Moore. Warren Moore, I'm sorry, Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore, before we had our break, we were talking about the difference in segregation in the northern parts of the United States and the southern parts of the United States. And I'd like to continue that line of thought. If you would, again, give us some information in reference to how you perceive or how you see those differences, recognizing that segregation is a part of the fabric of the United States of America, but at the same time there were differences in the North as in the South, and if we could talk about that.
Well, I think since 1865, with the Bill of Manumission, came certain enactments of laws to circumvent that freedom. And certainly all during the 1870s, we saw a rash of laws undoing some of the provisions of that new manifestation of freedom. I think in the North you had de facto segregation in that it was understood that certain areas under the guises of being ethnic communities were essentially barriers to black people. Blacks really had no place to go, hence you had the development of ghettos. They were relegated to certain parts of town. I think that's generally true if we look back 30, 40 years in most towns. Indeed, if you look there now, you'll find a heavy concentration of blacks within the inner city, which is just a continuation of the same system.
Very good. All primarily a result of that de facto segregation that appeared in the northern parts of the United States. Now, I think one of the hallmarks in reference to de facto segregation was that it did not have legislation to support it, which is quite different in the southern parts of the United States, is it not, Dr. LaFayette?
Yes, that's true. And in fact, the laws, particularly in the area of housing, affected discrimination, you know, in housing all over the United States, and mainly affected the northern communities because you have such a large concentration, you know, of blacks. And there are certain periods, for example, in the South, where the proximity is even closer in terms of blacks and whites living nearby, but the condition of the houses are quite different. But I just wanted to point out some of the provisions in the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. Well, first of all, it created three important national agencies. First was the Community Relations Service. Okay, this was in the Justice Department, and basically it was investigative agency, and it was also empowered with providing information to the courts to help them make decisions. They also had a provision there that dealt with conciliation, and that was the idea of trying to resolve these problems without conflict, or trying to resolve the conflict. So they went in many times, like in Selma, Alabama and other places, and talked to people on both sides to see if they can bring the leadership together so that
reconciliation and
sure, right. And they also had access to certain information by power of the authority. So it gave a federal agency the authority to go in and act with some sense of power. The other important thing, even though it was on public accommodations, another important agency was created was the Equal Employment Commission. And that meant that there was no discrimination then in hiring, and particularly in federal contracts. So many of the states in the South received federal contracts, and this provided that if they were caught, found to be guilty of hiring people on a discriminatory basis, then they would stand to lose their federal contracts.
And so those are the provisions, several of the provisions for that 1964 Act.
Exactly.
In addition, I think there was another provision that created, in a real sense, on the various state levels, human relations commissions, and I think we call ours Human Rights Commission here in Tennessee. Dr. Moore, perhaps you could give us some information about the commission that you serve as the executive director of at this present moment.
The Tennessee Human Rights Commission was originally established as the Human Relations Commission by executive order, operating basically out of the governor's office in 1963. It was later set up by statute in 1967 as the Human Development Commission, and with a name change in '84, it became the Human Rights Commission. But essentially, it does trace its roots generically to the Civil Rights Act, in that the laws which we enforce are those embedded in the Civil Rights Act, because from '67 on, we have been amending the Act to reflect comparability to federal law. So in that sense, we consider ourselves a part of that '64 Act.
Now, looking over human rights and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the state of Tennessee, Dr. Moore, what can you give our viewers in reference to the progress that has been made in these areas, or the lack of progress thereof?
Well, I think just breaking it down, talking about employment, housing, public accommodations, there have been vast gains in those areas. All you have to do is look at the workforce. You have a complete change in the complexion of the workforce, not only just talking about minorities, racial minorities, but you have women who are doing technical things that they weren't allowed to do before. They're in managerial positions, high visibility positions. Certainly there is, you know, much more to be accomplished, and that's by virtue of the competition that's built within the workforce itself. People want to achieve even greater heights than they have. There are some quarters in which there seems to be a backing up or a backsliding, as it were, and I think that might be traceable to some of the recent Supreme Court decisions giving, sort of emboldening certain employers and others who didn't want to comply in the first place, and now they feel free not to.
Dr. Moore, let us stop there and come back again during this last segment and talk about the impact of some of the things that have been happening recently in reference to the 1964 Act. And we'll be back with you following this commercial break.